Hello and welcome to the next in our series of lockdown live stream interviews with Glasgow Loves EU. And tonight we've got Claire Taylor from the Scottish Farmer magazine, and we're going to be talking all things agriculture and farming and food. And helping us tonight we have Bernd from our Glasgow Loves EU group, who's doing the technical aspects, and Paul, who will be watching out on Facebook for you to send in any of your questions. So if you think of anything you'd like to ask or any comments, please put them on there and we will try and bring them up in the discussion. So welcome to the group, Claire, and we're looking forward to the talk. And just to give you a wee bit of background on Claire, Claire grew up on a small beef farm in Ayr, where her family raised belted Galloway cattle. Breaking the family tradition of becoming a vet, she went on to study international relations and politics at Edinburgh University. She then began working life at the BBC in 2014 and worked for 3 years as a freelance in news and went on to become the main producer on BBC Scotland's election and Brexit TV debates. And then, choosing to combine her passions for farming and politics, she joined Scottish Farmer magazine in 2017, where as part of the team, she has been on the front line covering all things Brexit, including concerns over future trading standards, protecting Scottish food producers and our iconic food brands, and reporting on skills and labour shortages across the industry. Claire is passionate about the future of the rural economy and feels privileged to be in a role where she can inform the public on the changing political climate. And she was also telling us all about how she volunteers and goes into Glasgow primary schools to tell them about farming. So that sounded a great thing. And it's through the Royal Highland Education Trust, the Clyde division. So if there's any teachers out there listening, you might want to look up about that. So I suppose we better get on with the discussion because there's lots to talk about tonight. So, and just to say also that Glasgow Loves EU, we are an apolitical group. We're not aligned with any political parties. We're just at the moment campaigning for good future relations with the EU and looking tonight at the facts around the various forms of Brexit. So just to give us some background, because we're not all used to farming here, could you just explain what was the current system under the EU that farmers had to support them on their farms and things?
Thanks, Jenny, so much for a lovely introduction. Hopefully I can live up to some of the things and the knowledge that you mentioned there. But just to start on that, so around a third of EU funding support goes to agriculture. And this is to ensure a stable and affordable food supply, and also to ensure that farmers make a reasonable living as well. So that this is delivered within Scotland via the Common Agricultural Policy, which some people will know of. And this within Scotland, this counts for about 580 million in funding. And this is delivered through two pillars. And the first pillar is direct payments. And this is to protect farmers against market volatility. So this is mainly delivered via an area-based payment. So the amount of land that is owned by landowners and farmers and crofters. There's also various things within this, such as a greening payment for environmental practice. There's a young farmers payment for those under 40, and there's also a payment for maintaining livestock numbers. Within the second pillar of support, which is a much smaller amount, this goes towards supporting development of rural areas, and a lot of this is tied around the environment. So this is schemes such as forestry grants. We're looking to encourage new entrants into farming, so there's a new entrant grant, and I won't go into all the different things within Pillar 2, there's so many, but a very key one to mention is what's called our LFAS payment. So that's our Less Favoured Area Support Scheme. And this is to support farmers who are farming on very unproductive land. So if we look at areas in the west coast of Scotland, which is within the structure, it's deemed sometimes as Region 3 land. So this is unproductive land and farmers don't make a huge income off the land. So they really rely on this payment from the EU to be able to stay in these areas and to support the local rural communities. And that's one of the vital parts of this payment. So that's your Pillar 1 direct payments and your Pillar 2, which is for this Rural Development Fund.
Okay, and I'm presuming that really they couldn't carry on farming without this unless food prices went right up. Is that the sort of idea?
Yeah, that's the thing. The reason farming has subsidies is because food doesn't have its true value, and that is, I said earlier, that's why CAP is there. It's just so we can have this affordable and stable supply of food. And we're already seeing in parts of the west coast of Scotland some hill clearances with farmers leaving the land because they can't make an income anymore. They're competing against very tight margins. So funding is so important, and there's a I'm sure Fergus Ewing, MSP, who is our secretary for the rural environment and food and farming, and he said once that for every pound that is spent in these isolated rural communities, that can deliver £4 or £5 worth into that area, into local schools, and keeping people in those areas. So it's so vital that we keep people in these parts of Scotland.
Good. Okay, so that's the background. And how did what was your feeling or among the farmers? How do you think they voted in the EU referendum, or what was their feeling at that time? Have opinions changed, and did it maybe depend on what type of farming they were doing?
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people watching, there's a sort of conception that farmers voted for Brexit. And what I will say is that it was a mixed bag for Brexit, but north of the border in Scotland is very different to what farmers are feeling about Brexit down south. There's a divide in that, and a lot of this comes back to what I've just mentioned. For some of Scottish farmers working this really unproductive land, so they depended a lot more on these EU subsidies. And for example, some of your arable farmers down in Devon who may not have needed this vital payment. So if we strip it back to the sort of why people voted for Brexit, even within Scotland, I think early on they were very much sold this story that outside of the EU we'll still maintain our relationship and free access to our trading partner of the EU, which will mean freedom of access to people, to labour, which is so important in agriculture, but also allow for these extra export market opportunities. And a lot of farmers are very anti the EU system of the Common Agricultural Policy. It's been labelled as archaic by many. It very much rewards people for owning land and as opposed to being productive. So you're seeing a lot of landowners holding on or buying up swathes of land, and it's preventing people coming onto the land who are maybe innovative or wanting to be productive with that land. So a lot of people saw this as an opportunity to create a framework for a new funding support system which could reward productivity of Scottish landscape and also match the profile of Scottish farmers. But if we now look, it's 4 years down the line, and here we are with a no-deal Brexit. It could be on the cards. And the National Farming Union has publicly come out and said a no-deal Brexit would be a catastrophe for Scottish farming. And that is whether you voted Brexit or not. I think everybody agrees a no-deal Brexit is not good for farming. And what could happen under a no-deal Brexit, I'm sure we'll go into this at another point, is we could face huge tariffs on certain exports. We might not have this access to the EU market. We need that for labour. And at the moment, we have a huge food standards row going on as well in terms of future trading standards. And that is something we pride ourselves on in the UK, is that we are a nation of quality, not quantity, and we are governed by exceptionally strict welfare and food production standards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the no deal Brexit certainly is scary because, nobody voted for no deal. But would it really be bad? And I guess freedom of movement as well. We've seen that this year already, that they were struggling to get people onto the fruit farms. And we saw plane loads of people coming in. They were bringing people in. Have you heard from the Scottish fruit farms? Did they manage to get enough workers this year? Or and is that likely to be an ongoing problem with no deal, if we had no deal Brexit?
Well, the two parts to that question, and I'll start with the soft fruit pickers there as well, and that's something I've been following closely over the last few years. And what I will start by saying is this isn't just a Brexit issue with the fruit farmers, because a lot of our season, our let's say our strawberry season from April to September, we rely heavily on bringing workers from out with the UK, not just, but at the moment, within the EU. Because the pound has dropped in value over the last few years, a lot of EU workers are choosing not to come to Scotland anyway, because they could find farms closer to their neighbouring countries. So we're already seeing an issue of that. So there's a separate debate going on right now within soft fruit farming to actually recruit out with the EU. But if we focus more on this year's effort, so you'll have seen that, the nationwide campaign went out calling for furloughed workers and others to start picking our soft fruit. Otherwise it would go to rot, and which is something we've seen in previous years when we've had our early hot summers and there's not been the pickers to get the fruit. But from speaking to farmers on the ground, there were quite a few that already had EU workers on site, but before the flight restrictions were put in place, so they were covered in the early stages, and there was a great take up by the nation. Actually, there was huge applications and be put forward, and I know there was trepidation on the part of farmers, because in general we don't engineer a local workforce for picking fruit, and were people going to be able to hack the work, the long hours, and there's a lot of questions around the pay involved, but actually it has been there is good pay involved with picking as well, if you're willing to put in some of the longer hours. And I think now we get later into the season, like you said, there's been plane loads arriving with people coming here to pick, but they had enough at the early start of lockdown to be able to pick fruit. If I go back to your question before, the first part of your question about a no-deal Brexit, which I think I've said about being a catastrophe for British farming. But if we look into why that would be, if we were to revert to World Trade Organization tariffs, some of our sectors, for example, if we go back to the sheep farmers, I've been mentioning quite a lot on the West Coast, 80% of our sheep exports out with the UK go to Europe, and they could be facing tariffs of up to 50% on their produce, which could decimate the industry. Our beef exports could be looking at tariffs of around 65%, and we already, I think last year, that a former chief economist for the National Farming Union actually predicted it. I think his name was Dr. Sean Ricard, that 50% of our British farms could look to go out of business in the mid-20s if we have a no deal. So this is a real concern. And then we've all seen some of the headlines as well about backups of products at the borders as well. These would have to be checked. These got to require veterinary certification. We currently have a shortage of vets in the UK. A lot of our vets come from Europe, and all vets will need to certify every product that's exported, so that is going to hold up deliveries as well. And if we keep on the subject of vets as well, if we look at our abattoir sector, over 95% of our vets come from the EU, and I mean this is a huge part of our red meat processing sector, which we need these vets on site for. So there's so many real worries here around having an available workforce to be able to continue to keep the food supply chain going.
Yeah, it's interesting. Paul is saying there's a question. Have you got a question there on this?
I do, yeah. So the question from Barbara, just asking about, well, essentially expressing anxiety of, what might happen under no deal Brexit in terms of just food supply, really. But she's asking, sort of farmers that did vote for Brexit, how did that happen? Was there just a lack of awareness about what these issues were, or was there a degree of naivety about protection of subsidies and protection of standards, or what? How do we explain that?
I don't think it was a question of naivety. If we go back to what I was saying about the way funding was delivered through the cap system within the EU, I mean, it was literally rewarding people to be unproductive, and a lot of farmers wanted to get out of a subsidy system that is throwing money at people that aren't delivering goods. So that was a huge part of it. So I do think there was a bit of wishful thinking from government in terms of saying that we will maintain free unfettered access to the EU and free trade, trade between. I mean, that was maybe wishful thinking on that point, but I think there was that genuine interest in moving away and creating a system of financial support which is more unique to what our farmers have. And if I can explain for a second, if you think about some of the fruit farmers in Spain and the climates and the climate for farming there compared to somebody in the Isle of Skye, I mean, we're still governed under the same rules in the EU, but with such different farming practices. So the idea of having a bespoke system for Scottish or UK agriculture, was a positive to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know we're going to go on and look at the trade bill, but we've sort of, in reading the background to all this, well, I certainly came across it, it looked a little bit like they were going to start doing the same issue with the UK bill, didn't it? With like rewarding for environmental practice and rewarding, not actually for the production of goods. Seemed to be, there was a bit of a warning about that, wasn't there? But
Yeah.
I'm guessing you're going to probably touch on that. So just to talk then, we'll move on to looking at these bills, the agriculture bill and things. So what are the main differences between the Scottish agriculture bill that's going through the Scottish Parliament, which has got the second reading in June, compared with the UK agriculture bill, which is now in the House of Lords? So yeah, what could you say about that?
Well, I'll first start with the UK agriculture bill, because we do know quite a lot more about the UK agricultural bill. So this is basically putting a structure in place to continue payments to farmers post Brexit, and it's very much what I mentioned earlier to Paul's question there. It's to move away from this area-based payment to farmers, and it's to look towards a public goods model, which, I mean, this public goods model is talked about a lot, and it sounds much more confusing than it is. It's basically about rewarding farmers for environmental goods. So they could be setting boundaries aside in their land for wildflowers and to support pollinators. They could be taking new efforts to improve soil structure. They could be planting more trees to help with our environmental targets of climate change. So it's very much about what farmers are doing to promote environmental goods, but also there'll be a lot of precedence on animal welfare, and that was one of the big things that came into the second reading of the UK Ag Bill was around animal welfare. But Jenny, you said there as well about, is it all on land management, and what about food production? And that is something that was really missing from the initial stages of the UK agriculture bill. It's completely focused on environmental goods when really we've just had a health pandemic which has resulted in issues of our food supply, and food security and production has never been more important. And it was really embarrassing, and I can say this on behalf of a lot of people in farming. At the start of the year, we had one of the chief advisors to the Treasury, Professor Tim Lunick, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was advising the government that there was no need for farmers, and that we could actually, just import all of our food. And he compared us to a model like Singapore. I mean, a completely different landlocked nation, and already, we're at 60% self-sufficient in food. Suddenly we hit a pandemic where we're obviously we're cut off from some of our major imports, and we're having to really, tighten our food supply chains over here. So he, I'm sure, is really eating his words for saying something like that. And just a little bit more about the actual agricultural bill. So what will happen is from this year, Rishi Sunak has guaranteed that the same level of funding for CAP to English farmers. However, from 2021 and for the next 7 years, they're going to be phasing out direct payments, and so they're moving completely away from that area-based payment. So in Scotland, there's not as much to talk about with the Scottish Agricultural Bill, but at the moment they're saying that, from 2021 onwards, they're trying to tweak the existing CAP and simplify it as well, but they want to maintain these payments for farmers up until 2024 to give some stability to Scottish farming. And in that time, they're going to be looking at different pilots to deliver financial support as well. But there's more will come from that when we know the sort of budget that we're going to be looking at with the Scottish Agricultural Bill. But also, I think Fergus Ewing MSP has made it quite clear that there's farmers, I'm harping back again to these farmers in the west coast of Scotland who really, it's vital that they receive some of these direct payments, because for some of them, that could be 80%, 90% of their income. And if suddenly we move entirely away from a direct payment support, we could have huge hill clearances in parts of Scotland. And these parts of Scotland is what sells an advert of Scotland, sells this advert for Visit Scotland, of why people want to come to this country. So we need these farmers on the land managing these landscapes, because they're managed, they're not wild landscapes as a lot of people can describe them as.
Yeah, and I guess there's the danger again of people buying up swathes of land and actually not farming at all and claiming these
yeah,
sort of
and that
finances
is something,
unless it's written in some. Yeah. Now, what were we going on to next? So I think we were going to maybe ask you about the sort of food standards that were in the agriculture bill. So there was a bit that was going through the House of Lords, and there's been a bit of controversy about these food standards. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so there is an ongoing row over food standards standards, and particularly in regards to our future trade deals. So, I mean, it was a few months ago while the UK Agriculture Bill was going through the House of Commons, Neil Parish MP introduced an amendment which would effectively enshrine food standards in legislation, and this was voted down by a majority of MPs. And the intent of this amendment was to make sure that we're not, undersold on our standards in the future. And as you've seen the headlines of chlorinated chicken and hormone beef, and it's to make sure farmers, are on an even playing field and have that competitive edge in the future, and also not to endanger food safety as well. The UK government did vote this down, which obviously sparked a lot of controversy. We had the National Farming Union launch a petition at the time to enshrine this legislation that received about 1 million signatures from the public. But what the UK government has done recently, and under pressure from organisations like National Farming Union, is they've created a Trade and Agriculture Commission, which is a body which should oversee future trade deals, and they will produce within 6 months. They'll produce a report to the UK Parliament on with advice. What I will say is that this is only advisory, and some people have said, is this a fig leaf for future standards? Has it got the teeth? But at this point, that is what the UK government, they have answered that, and they've done that, and they've also keep saying, it's in our manifesto. We've got a commitment to future food standards, and when you bring up things like chlorinated chicken and hormone beef with people like Liz Truss, she always makes the point that this is something that we already have in law from the EU. And I guess the question there is, will we then pass this framework into future UK legislation, or will we need to design new legislation for things like chlorinated chicken and hormone beef?
Yeah, I know, it's quite a worry, isn't it? And the bill that's gone through the Scottish Parliament, you said there was the bill going through the Scottish Parliament, and then there's the UK one. Did we hear a rumour that the UK government was going to be able to veto the decisions on the Scottish Parliament on that? Have you heard anything about that?
I think there's a lot of talk in the press and various groups about, the devolved competencies, because of course, Scotland has devolved power over agriculture. We've got a separate agricultural bill where there's your trade bill, which is reserved as well. And as far as I've been told, the UK government have pledged to absolutely, support that we have devolved competency over agriculture. But I mean, there's been headlines suggesting power grabs and different things, but at this stage it's difficult to know. And I guess for the UK government, for them, protecting the internal market is really important. They want to make sure there's mutual standards across borders. So if you had a Scottish farmer, you want to make sure that you're at the same competitive advantage of our English farmers. So for them, it's about maintaining those welfare and production standards. And I will kind of say again that, so I talked about the EU being our one of our biggest trading partners. Well, actually, our domestic market is our biggest trading partner. So 60% of our exports go to England and to the other nations of the UK. Sorry, so that is something that the UK will want to protect.
Yeah, those exports that go. So is it animals and sort of the crops and things that are exported down to England? Yeah.
And actually a fun fact, well, I don't actually know the figure behind it, but actually, even though we have the fantastic landscape in Scotland to produce lamb, we don't actually eat a lot of our own lamb. Most of our lamb is exported to England, and earlier I was saying about exports to the EU of our lamb as well, so it just is interesting that as well.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, buy Scottish lamb if you're not a vegetarian. Yeah. So Paul, was there any questions on the agriculture bill, or have we turned everyone off from the details?
Policy.
I think there are a couple, but I think you've probably covered them really. So a question from Bill about what actual hard guarantees do we have from the UK government about maintaining subsidy levels, which is essentially the timetable that you've outlined, I suppose. So I think you've covered that. Yeah,
I mean that's the thing, and hard guarantees. Are there any hard guarantees at the moment? If I'm honest, that's something, we don't know.
Yeah, it's very worrying for farmers. Yeah.
And what I'll add in there as well, I know it doesn't quite answer that question, but it's difficult for farmers as well, because they're making decisions 5, 6, 7 years in advance, and that way out with a budgetary year. So they're putting crops in the ground, they're investing in years to come as well. So farmers do really need to have have certainty, which is why I believe that the Scottish Government has committed until 2024, and that is just to basically give that commitment to Scottish farmers that payment will be guaranteed for those next few years.
Yeah. Well, at least that's something. Yeah. Okay, so just moving on to thinking about sort of food, the food supply, and we'd had the images of the empty supermarket shelves during lockdown, and we were all hunting down wheat and flour. It became the sort of valuable commodity. And was the government unprepared for this food supply chain disruption, and have farms managed to sort of up the demand or cope with the demands on them?
Yeah, so what's very interesting about this, it was actually only, I think, last week, I mentioned earlier the MP Neil Parish. So he is the chair of the Environmental, Food and Rural Affairs Committee in Westminster, and they did a report, an inquiry into the government's response to COVID and to the food supply, and they actually have just delivered this report, and they've actually come out and said, the advice issued by government wasn't quick enough. They were too behind, and they were seeing images from other parts of Europe of these supermarket shelves, yet they weren't communicating to key workers within the food supply chain, which is why we had so many disruptions, and they needed to give more advice on social distancing measures, and that was a real failing on the UK government's part. And I think the advice from this inquiry was saying, if there is a second wave in the future, this is something food security needs to be addressed very early on to avoid this, because in many cases we had the product there, but we just didn't have the means of delivering it onto the shelves, and that was the problem. But then the other part of your question is, how did farmers react? So demand during COVID for buying local absolutely shot through the roof. And as a farmer and a farming journalist myself, it was a really wonderful thing to see, was this direct buying behaviour. So you saw a lot of people going to their local butchers or going to their local farm shops, and this is hopefully going to be one of the positive lasting legacies from COVID, is this sort of this buy local revolution, something we hope will continue longer term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been a few positives, and you were telling me before our interview that you had actually visited America and seen some of the interesting sort of food production methods there, and some of the quite advanced things that you saw. Could you tell us some more about that?
Yeah, so I visited America. It was May 2019, and there was about 2 weeks I spent there, and I was sort of based between Chicago, Illinois, and Wisconsin. So I was visiting. Wisconsin is the heart of America's dairyland, so that was focusing more on the dairy farming side of things. And in Illinois, I visited a beef feedlot, and I guess when we talk about America, often we talk about sort of intensive farm feedlots, and I actually got to visit one in person. And the one that I visited, the farmer sort of described the process as a hotel, and he kept the revolving door open to people bringing in their animals, fattening them and moving them on. And people would actually buy a slot in his feedlot where they would fatten up their animals. They'd arrive at 8 months old, I should have said that, and then they would fatten them up for the next 6 months to a certain specification. And part of this fattening process that he did involved a hormone injection. So this was a growth stimulant which was put into the ear. And I was told, this disappears within 120 days, and it cost $3 to administer, and they were saving $20, or they were getting back $20 per animal, and they were seeing like a 10% increase in growth rates. So, these animals, it was to reduce the fat content and to increase muscle. And this is what a lot of US consumers are wanting. So they're really using these hormone injections to meet consumer demand. So it's just very, very interesting seeing that side of things. I know obviously there's a lot of concerns about hormone beef as well. And for farmers, they're under pressure to meet these targets. They're on tight margins. So my empathy was slightly more there with the farmers. It was just more, the pressure from government. But at the same feedlot, which I think it was 8,000 head of cattle that they fatten every year, and if you compare that to what we have in Scotland, is quite humongous. And this is probably one of the smaller feedlots. But that day that I arrived, they just had a delivery of Holstein cattle from around 900 miles away in Pennsylvania. And I asked, what's the traceability like of these animals? There's no traceability. There's no electronic tag system like we have here, where every cow has a passport. And that's a real concern for biosecurity. I mean, that is something here. You think about every movement. When my cattle, my belted galleries go out to shows or they go anywhere, it gets marked in a passport so we can track any disease back. So that's a real concern. But also, not only is that journey not being monitored, like that also removes the provenance of food. I mean, this is something we're moving towards in Scotland and wider parts of the UK, is about buying locally, rearing locally, slaughtering locally. And there's animals are being transported 1,000 miles at least to be slaughtered. I mean, that goes against the model that we're moving towards in Scotland. And I'm conscious of time, so I won't go on too much about it, but chlorinated chicken, I need to mention that. So I was told by US government officials in America that 20% of chickens undergo this chlorination process. And what I will say is that I think sometimes the media can miscommunicate around chlorinated chicken sometimes. It's not a public health issue, it's an animal welfare issue, because the chlorination process is only needed because, the way that the production process up until that point, whether, it's not got the strict standards that we have, they need to dose these animals, this poultry in chlorine to remove to remove different organisms from them. So that is a real concern in terms of animal welfare. So I can see why there's a concern, but I think the focus needs to be on animal welfare, not on public health, which is definitely where the argument has been leading towards recently.
Yeah, and important. And did you see the production of the chickens? Because I mean, even here, I've seen a film of chickens, and they're pretty packed in anyway. Were they even more packed in there?
I didn't. The region we were in didn't have poultry farming. It was more the beef side of things and the dairy farming that I was there to see. And with America in so many different states, we only got in a couple of different states in our trip, unfortunately.
Yeah. So presumably these feedlot cattle, there was no grass to be seen. And
so what happens is often up until 8 months old, the cattle are grazed outside, but then over that 6-month period where they're being fattened, they're indoors and they're fed a mixture, like a grain diet. And what I would say is that there was a lot of investment in cow comfort and animal welfare. Like the farmer definitely, he bought specialist mats for his animals. There was air conditioning brought in. So I mean, there was thoughts on cow comfort there. It was just, I guess the issue there was the traceability for me and the tags. And obviously we all want to see pictures of animals grazing outside. But one of the things I learned in Wisconsin is some of these dairy farmers can't have their cattle outside all year because of the variations in temperature. That they wouldn't be able to keep their cattle outside. So instead, they've invested very much in cow comfort indoors. And it's similar in Scotland. There's parts of Scotland that literally can't have, because of our how wet some of our regions are. We can't have animals outside a lot of the year round as well. So there was some similarities there between farmers.
Yeah. Okay, it's interesting. And another issue that I think you mentioned, you'd visited a genetically modified sort of research place, and last week we were talking with John Purvis, the former Conservative MEP, and he mentioned some of the aspects of genetic modification of crops and things. And did you visit something like that in America?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name. It was a Wisconsin Crop Innovation Center, I'm sure it was called. And it was, for me, what was very interesting, I think it's very relevant to listeners as well, is that it talked about the differences between genetic modification and gene editing. And I think too often these are grouped as one by the media and various parties. So, with gene editing, if I can try and do this in a simple way, it's basically you have one organism and you can remove a gene from that organism to maybe to help it with better protect against certain diseases, but you're not actually altering anything different to what nature's already given that organism. Whereas with genetic modification, you are inserting genes from another species into another organism, so you're more meddling with the blueprints of nature in that sense. And as an example for gene editing, when we were there, they were talking about the Arctic apple, if anyone's heard of that. And this is 10 years of trials in America. And it was basically to genetically remove the browning element of the Arctic apple, because they found that, you bite into an apple, oxidization, it goes brown. And it was to try and keep that, to not have that discoloration, because it was leading to huge food waste. And this is something that they've done over there, and they're hoping this will be, a great thing for food waste. If you think about, food waste in this country is about a third of our food is wasted. So anything in moving towards that sort of thing could be seen as good. But it's a very emotional topic, gene editing and GMO. I mean, it's been emotional for many years, and actually only this week it was announced in the House of Lords that the government are actually going to release a consultation which will explore precision breeding techniques which gene editing falls under, and that will start in the autumn, and that's to basically just open up to the public to explore whether or not gene editing is something that the UK will explore post-Brexit. And the reasons some people put for gene editing is the fact with climate change, some of our crops are coming up against increased levels of disease and pests, and if we could make these crops resistant, then we wouldn't need to use pesticides, when we're trying to move away from pesticide usage and to have a greener climate as well. But then there's still a huge amount of emotion around this topic, because once something has been modified or edited, there's no controlling where that goes or the effect that could have on public health. I mean, so far the science says that it's okay, but there's still a lot of skepticism around this. So it's going to be a very interesting consultation. And in Scotland, we're anti gene editing, and in the UK they're exploring this. So this could prove a bit of a battleground for future debates between Scotland and the UK, because if we had farmers in England who, let's say, were benefiting from a gene edited crop, that would put them at an unfair advantage to our Scottish farmers. So again, the internal market standards thing comes into play with that.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting debate. Yeah. And so my last question, and then we'll maybe see if there's any more from the public as well, but Glasgow was due to host the climate conference this year, and I think it's been postponed to next year. Farming does get a bit of criticism sometimes with its impact on the climate. Do you think that's justified, or has there been any improvements recently?
I think it's really interesting you asking me, even just given the data is just now, because this time last year we had the publication of the Intergovernmental Panel report on climate change. And that at that point, you'll have all seen the headlines, do your bit to save the planet, stop eating red meat. And this is a shock for farming when these headlines came out, because the distinction wasn't being made between, for example, your Scottish model of farming and what I've been talking about, this US model of farming, because there's no excusing. I'm not going to excuse some of the practices in US feedlots and, ultimately that leading to higher levels of methane production, deforestation in the Amazon. Again, nobody can excuse that behaviour, but to lump it into the same bracket as agriculture caused a lot of upset. And in Scotland, well, not in Scotland, sorry, in the UK, cattle produce around 5% of greenhouse gas emissions, which if you compare with transport, power and industry, they account for around 69%. So it's low, but it can still be improved, and farmers are making efforts. So I was talking earlier about, the extensive grazing systems of the west coast of Scotland, sheep farmers, I'm always going on about that, but what they're effectively doing is they're providing a carbon sink where they are storing carbon under the ground to stop it from releasing into the atmosphere through this process. There's also, it's farmers on the front line delivering in terms of tree targets. There's lots of grants right now, and agroforestry is one of the things. You're combining livestock and forestry farming. So again, that's part of it too. So farmers are very much committed to being part of the solution, not part of the problem. And a lot of this will play out in the future ag bills as well, because if we're driven to produce environmental goods, farmers are going to be, to receive a subsidy, they're going to have to work on their carbon footprint. So that's something we'll see play out as well.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. Good.
And can I add in just there as well? I should have said at the start, within Scotland, only 15% of our land can you grow vegetables and fruit on. I mean, that's 15%. So if we were to, we're being told to increase our fruit and veg consumption, which obviously is a really important thing, a part of a balanced diet. But actually, there's not the room in Scotland for that, because 85% can only be planting trees or grazing cattle and sheep. So a lot that could push us to importing more from other countries, which again plays into, our carbon footprint if we're importing more food. And we've seen a spike in like the consumption of things like avocados and almonds for almond milk, and these are really water intensive practices which are not good for the climate either. So it's, do we export our climate responsibility elsewhere? So there's got to be a balance, and the balance has got to be that we have a mixed diet. It shouldn't be too meat heavy. It should be a balance, but it should be sourcing locally, slaughtering locally, and keeping that carbon footprint as neutral as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So Paul, was there any questions coming in there?
Yeah, so a question from Joanna. From the point of view of people like us, really, grassroots activists, what would you say is the most important issue that we should be raising with MPs, MSPs? With respect to farming and agriculture, what should we be hassling about?
Most important issue, I guess, is oh goodness, there's so many, but I think protecting our relationship and our access to the EU is very important as a major trading partner, and to maintain that supply of labour is very important. But then I'm also going to say, protecting our food standards, it's absolutely massive, and within that, animal welfare, that can never be undercut. So I'd say, maintaining that relationship with the EU, but also ensuring as we enter future trade deals that these standards that we have created in Scotland and the wider UK are not undermined.
Sorry, I was muted. Any more burning questions, or is that a good point to finish?
Maybe a good point to finish. Oh, there was one question about just vets, really, number of vets. Are we going to have enough in the future?
Yeah.
Well,
I will comment on that, because it's interesting. I ran an article in the paper last week, and it was a young farmer and vet who'd written in, and she was really challenging the current education system and saying how it's so heavily focused on academics that they're losing out on potentially fantastic vets coming into the sector. And I then had a young girl that wrote in as well and said, she was desperate to become a vet, and she'd been doing, incredible experience, hadn't got the grades at school, had gone on to college and was really working her way up, but was having no luck getting into the system. And there's a lot that needs to be restructured within the university practice of vets. We're also really low on farm vets. And a lot of this could be a lack of experience during the university process, as well as I think there's a real shake-up needed within the future, because vets are an absolute necessity if we're going to be, having certification, but also for maintaining our welfare standards and providing that service as well.
Yep, that is an interesting point, and a lot of planning or needing to be done quickly to make changes, because it's a number of years for training. Yeah. Oh, well, that was really good. It was a really good discussion this evening, Claire. Thank you very much for talking to us, and lots of food for thought. That was a good pun, and that wasn't deliberate. So thank you for that, and thank you for everyone watching. Hope you've enjoyed the discussion this evening. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.